This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so this is basically an advisory to the community because I suspect this issue affects many of us. This is an engagement that we have, a number of us have uh, participated in driving an effort with NIST to relax some of their uh, guidelines around asymmetric key derivation. The basic issue is that if you're going to go get a thing FIPS certified, uh, there are requirements you need to follow about how you arrange your crypto, how you generate random numbers, how you derive asymmetric keys. And if you want to do attestation, if you want to do dice, you generally like the way dice is defined generally stipulates that you're doing deterministic asymmetric key derivation. You start with some secret value, some seed UDS, and you permute it with measurements taken at boot time into a CDI, which you then deterministically turn into an asymmetric key. And then you can sign that key with a certificate, add some dice measurements to that certificate, and move on. Dice is not the only way, the only reason you'd want to do deterministic key derivation, but it's a strong industry need. There are other cases where you want to make a key and make it deterministic. However, the problem is NIST doesn't actually define a way to do this. There is no allowed mechanism. Uh, so this kind of devolves into narratives. Are there certain ways you can characterize what you're doing in a way that doesn't run afoul of the plain reading of the standards? So to resolve this, we're proposing a couple of ways forward. Deterministic use of cryptographic keys, and that has a specific meaning in dice link or in NIST lingo, or deterministic use of DRBGs, which is a construct that's used to mix bits together to provide a pseudorandom bit stream. Uh, at a high layer or a high level, why you'd want to make a key and make it deterministically. Well, let's say there's a module that wants to wield an asymmetric key known only to itself, derived in part from dynamic inputs. Like these could be measurements, could be whatever. And you want to associate long-lived data with these keys. So certificates is one. If you want to like issue a certificate for a dice key, you'd like that key not to change on you. Or if you're encrypting data to a key pair, you again don't want that key to change on you. If it does, your ciphertext is blown away. So yeah, and then you want the lifetime of these things to be tied to those dynamic inputs so that they remain available. And we don't have enough storage within the hardware module uh, to remember these keys that we've generated. I mentioned dice, so dice is one example where you start with a proper random bit generator, write some entropy out to fuses, you blow that during manufacturing, and then you pipe it through a derivation tree to derive some CDIs from some measurements, and then off of those you make your asymmetric keys and you issue certificates for these keys. You want those certificates to be long-lived. Basically, you want these certificates to be viable and valid as long as these measurements do not change. And if those measurements do change, you want those certificates to be blown away. TPM is another use case where, let's say, you want to encrypt some data such that the TPM is the only one that can decrypt it, and it only will decrypt it if some given policy is satisfied. Like, let's say, for example, the TPM has some internal counter. You want to make sure that it's equal to some value, and only if it's equal to that value will the TPM actually be willing to decrypt your secret. So the TPM spec allows you to pass that policy in a serialized form to the TPM. From that policy, it will derive a key pair, a public key, which you can then use as an encryption key to encrypt your plaintext, produce some ciphertext, and then time passes and you want to go decrypt your ciphertext. You pass your ciphertext and the original policy down to the TPM. The TPM will verify that the policy is satisfied and then use that policy to derive the same key pair as before and decrypt your ciphertext. Uh, Given that there's an arbitrarily high number of possible policies, uh, there's also an arbitrarily high number of possible public keys that could result from those policies. And there's no way the TPM can remember all of those public keys. I suppose if it had gobs of internal storage, it could maybe pretend to remember them all, but eventually it would run out. And we don't have TPMs with like gigabytes of internal storage. So this kind of API flow calls for the TPM to deterministically make that key pair out of the policy. Now, many practitioners will work around these limitations by saying, okay, we won't deterministically make the key pair, we'll randomly generate it on the fly and then export it in an encrypted fashion so that we can re-import it later and then use the private key. And then the way these NIST rules are defined, the encryption key you use to encrypt that key pair, that can be deterministic. It's the asymmetric key that can't be, but the symmetric key can be. So you can get all the properties you want out of your key pair in that it's not available if certain dynamic inputs change, but it does require you to spit out a route private key. And that is challenging for a couple of reasons. Um, from a risk perspective, it does widen your attack surface a bit because now symmetric encryption is in scope for like glitch attacks, side channel analysis. It's a bit more safe if the module only ever exports public keys and signatures, certificates. And side channels aside, like suppose you have these wrapped private keys, it can be an engineering challenge to get them where they need to be, especially if you're doing dice. You need to make sure that those lowest boot layers can party on these key pairs when they need to, like at boot time. We can't just provide it to the module at any given point like we might be able to do with a TPM. And there are TPM flows which do involve wrapped key pairs. It's just there are also TPM flows which do not involve wrapped key pairs.
Is there any storage challenges, Jeff, or and then replay protection on that storage for those wrapped keys?
Sure. I mean, practically speaking, you do need a place to store this. So let's say if you're an SOC, you don't have flash inside you, you're going to need someone else to hold on to that key and then import it into you again. And if you want to ever like invalidate the wrapping key, that would be a problem as well. So the problem that NIST is solving with its standards is I want to make an asymmetric key pair that no one's ever seen before. And if I want to use it more than once, I can store it for later. So NIST says, you can start with an entropy source, instantiate a DRBG, a deterministic random bit generator, run it through an approved algorithm to derive an asymmetric key, and then maybe store it. Whereas we have a different problem on our hands. It is that we want to derive an asymmetric key that only we know about. The key must be bound to dynamic inputs that if those inputs change, the key changes. If those inputs don't change, the key does not change. And we don't have enough space to persist that key. So when it comes to mixing dynamic inputs into this flow here, there are a couple of places that are legal to mix them in. You can feed dynamic inputs as a personalization string to the DRBG, or you can take the output of the DRBG and XOR it with your dynamic inputs. So both of these are legal and allowed, and many people do either of these things when they want to take some input and mix it into the process. But the problem we face is at the bookends, beginning and end. It is that we start with an entropy source, right? So it changes every time we sample it. So the key we get out at the end will change every time we run through this flow. And as mentioned earlier, we don't have enough storage to persist these keys internally. And it's an engineering challenge to persist them externally. Any questions so far? Cool. So this is what we'd like to do. We would like the specs to allow us to do one of these two things, to start with a random bit generator, to store, now this is an acronym, KDK stands for a key derivation key. It's just a name for any cryptographic key that you use to derive another cryptographic key. Store that and then run it through a KDF. This is another construct that's distinct from a DRBG, but kind of a similar principle, just mixes bits together. Run through some derivation method and then make your asymmetric key. That would be just fine. Or use a DRBG. Have the RBG store your seed, then repeatedly throughout the lifetime of the device, instantiate the DRBG with your stored seed, and then run it through the approved algorithm to make your asymmetric key. Either of these would be acceptable for these deterministic asymmetric key use cases. But neither of these flows are actually legal today for a couple reasons. The first one is not legal because there is no defined approved mechanism to start from a KDF output and end up with an asymmetric key. You cannot do it. If you want to have an asymmetric key, you must start with a DRBG, or rather you must pull bits out of the DRBG. That is mandated. And if you have a DRBG, the input to the DRBG, there is a stipulation that you cannot ever reuse a seed to a DRBG. The point of the DRBG, as NIST has defined it, is to be something that you can pull bits out of and that are always random and always unique, and you never repeat yourself. And there are many cases where that's exactly what you need. It just so happens that we've kind of been hamstrung here because this is the only way to get an asymmetric key out, and we can't deal with asymmetric keys that change all the time. So we want to be able to reuse these seeds, and we simply can't.
Also, would this make sense? This wouldn't make sense anyway unless the stored seed is much, much smaller than the asymmetric key, correct?
Well, I don't know if the relative size of those two is as critical. Like what matters is like these dynamic inputs have a huge like domain. This is your hash of your firmware image of your dice, right? So you could have an arbitrarily high different number of these possible dynamic inputs, and they'll all produce a different asymmetric key, all based on the same stored seed. So that's, I think, where the size difference would matter, is that you can store one secure random value that easily can fit in fuses, and from that derive all of the asymmetric keys you would need.
There's also chaining. From that one seed, you may need to derive multiple different asymmetric keys, right?
Yep.
That's
Yep.
things like dice.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, if that condition is met, that you don't need the seed for each key, then I think then it works. Or you don't need a different seed for each key.
Yeah, if you had like 5 layers of dice and you had to use a different seed for every layer, that would be annoying. Like there's no reason why you'd have to do that. Yeah. So let's get into these approaches. So the first approach, right, starting with the KDF. Now I'm going to back up a little bit and just characterize the difference between a KDF and DRBG. So a KDF is kind of stateless. It takes its inputs, its input key, its context, personalization string, and then churns them through and produces an output. Now you can specify how many bits you want ahead of time. So say, hey, I want 10 bits out of this KDF, and it will actually use that length to then it'll mix your requested length into the bit stream, and then give you your output, and then it's done. DRBG, on the other hand, has an internal state. You instantiate it with a seed, personalization string, and then you can repeatedly pull bits out of it. Every time you pull bits out, it permutes the internal state, and then you can pull bits out again, and it will give you fresh bits. You can also, there's an operation defined on this to inject, to reseed it, to inject new entropy. And if you think that it's been a while, you pulled a lot of bits out, and it's been a while since you've put any entropy into it, you can push more entropy into it. So KDF, can we use that to derive asymmetric keys? If we didn't have to use DRBGs, could we use KDFs? Let's talk about that. So yes, we think we can. Proposal would be to amend FIPS 26-5. This is the document which says you can only use DRBGs. We want to amend this to say that there are methods to deterministically derive asymmetric keys from cryptographic keys being the inputs to a KDF, and then amend another special publication, which also mandates DRBG use to allow for these KDFs. There are various methods of deriving asymmetric keys. Some of them require fixed size random inputs, and some require repeated random sampling. So this would only, given the API of a KDF, this would only allow fixed size derivation, and I'll have a subsequent slide which illustrates that. And we can define a cryptographic key the way that SP 800-108 defines it, which is just a random bit string or a pseudorandom bit string that is indistinguishable from randomness. This is just the legalese that we would like to see. So let's talk about asymmetric key derivation. There's a special publication which divides symmetric from asymmetric keys. If you want to make a symmetric key, there are many different ways you can do that. You can pull from an RBG, pull from a KDF. You can combine a lot of many different keys together. But if you want to make an asymmetric key, then you must start from a GRBG. There's a section which defines how to make an RSA key and sections which define how to make ECC keys. But that's not a very useful way of dividing the world, asymmetric from symmetric. What's really better is to look at like which ones require repeated sampling and which ones can just party on fixed size input. So there is, for RSA, there is this method probable prime generation, which NIST defines, which as you pull some bits out, sample it, decide whether it's legit. If not, you reject it and repeat and keep sampling new random bits until you're done, until you found a prime, suitable primes. Or for RSA, you can do provable prime generation, where you pull out some fixed size input and then never consult the GRBG again and run through a deterministic algorithm to derive your RSA key. This is not done very often in practice. Most people, you make an RSA key for performance reasons, you want to use your probable prime generation, but it exists and it is defined by NIST. For ECC keys, we have what kind of thing? Rejection sampling. You pull out some bits. Is it a valid ECC key? No. All right. Keep sampling until you get one. There's also the mod operation, where you pull out some fixed size input, mod it until it's a valid, mod it into the range of a valid key according to your curve, and then you're done. So it would be nice if we can arrange things instead of requiring like this provable prime generation for RSA keys, which is defined here. There's no reason why you can't start with the output of a KDF. All this method requires is that the inputs be pseudorandom. And KDFs are perfectly able to produce pseudorandom bits, same as DRBGs. Just start with your seed, instantiate your thing, pull out some bits, and run it through your algorithm, and you're done. There's no reason why this shouldn't be legal. ECC keys, we have a lot more options. We can pull out some bits for the mod operation and do that. Again, no reason why that can't come from a KDF. We can do rejection sampling the same way as is defined against a DRBG. Just pull some bits out. Is it a valid key? No, reject it. And this is a method which is done a lot in practice, but is not recognized by NIST as a valid operation, but it certainly could be. So you pull out a hash size of bits and then sample some prefix to define is that a valid key? If not, you keep hashing it until you get a valid key. You just explore the space, and you're not likely to hash. You're likely to find a valid key before too many hash operations. This is not generally, you're not going to be spinning here very long. For rejection sampling, this is obviously like it's not cool if you reject, like let's say you boot some firmware which caused you to reject and now you're done, like you can't boot that firmware anymore. That's not nice. So if this were a DRBG, you could obviously just go and get fresh bits out, but we want to define a mechanism which doesn't require a DRBG. So what you can combine rejection sampling with a counter. Perfectly sensible. So start with your fixed input, your KDK, feed it through KDF, and you also have a counter. And every time you reject, you increment that counter, you'll get new pseudorandom bits out. and then eventually you will succeed in finding an ECC key. And this counter is necessary for the KDF because recall the KDF has no internal state. Unlike a DRBG, which you could just keep sampling and get new bits out. The KDF, if you kept sampling the KDF, you get the same output because it has no state. Any questions so far? Cool. So this is just a summary. So symmetric keygen, you can start with, you can have a lot of various inputs. You can start with DRBG. You can have a pre-existing key run through a KDF. You can have multiple existing keys and combine them together. Those are all valid operations according to NIST. There's no reason why we couldn't do the same with ECC derivations. Start with any of these inputs, run it through a deterministic operation, arrive at your ECC key. Same with RSA keys. No reason why this can't be defined. Again, provable prime generation is not commonly done, but there's no reason why it shouldn't be allowed. Now, the problem with this approach is that one of the documents which would need to be updated is FIPS 186-5, which is pretty brand spanking new. It just came out in like February this year. It was signed by the U.S. Secretary of Commerce, and so changing it at this point is not likely to be a very fast process. We certainly want to get this in the hopper, so when 186-6 comes out, we can be ready to intercept and have these flows available. But for now, this is it's not likely to see this in a publication anytime soon. Oh, yeah, sorry. Here's an illustration, KDFs, dice with KDFs. Just all these cells which previously just said derivation flow can replace those with a KDF and everything's legal and fine. Okay, so KDFs, I mentioned we have those problems about not being able to get that anytime soon. So let's talk about DRBGs. Those are legal. We can totally start with a DRBG and make an asymmetric key. The problem is that darn stored seed. Now, the seed rule requirements are actually defined in a special publication, not in a FIPS document, so those are much easier to change, which is nice. Let's talk about some inconsistencies here. Right now, FIPS 26-5 actually requires DRBG seed reuse to be legal, but SP 890A and C disallow it. What's depicted here is a flow which describes deterministic ECDSA signature generation, not key generation, but signature generation. If you want to make an ECDSA signature, there is this K value which can either be completely random. Like the requirement is that it never be reused for a different message. You want to sign two different messages, you cannot use the same K value, otherwise you leak your private key. So many implementations just say, okay, we'll make K totally random every time, and that's fine. But in cases where you don't have a TRNG at your disposal, you can do it deterministically based on your private key and the hash of your message. Just instantiate a DRBG based on those inputs, and then do rejection sampling. Keep sampling bits until it's a valid K, and then you're done. This obviously is, like, given those restrictions against ever reusing a DRBG seed, this is illegal. You cannot do this. And yet, 186-5 says this is a way you can do deterministic signature generation. So it's an inconsistency there. There is also an inconsistency around TPM devices. So if you're familiar with TPM, primary key derivation, what I illustrated in one of the earlier slides, what's happening under the hood is that we have a primary seed in internal flash, and whenever you want to make a primary key, you pass in the object attributes you want, what kind of key, what kind of policy you might have on it, and we spin up a DRBG and derive a key pair out of it. It does use NIST-approved algorithms for the output, but it starts with a deterministic seed, which is not legal according to NIST and FIPS. However, there exist certified TPM devices on the market, and the reason that's possible, and kind of the reason this has festered for so long, is because there has been a letter issued to CMP Labs. This is not an official NIST publication, but it is It did come from CMVP, saying that it basically gives a carve out. If you are a TPM device and you're doing primary key derivation, deterministic keys generation may be allowed, depending on the details of the algorithm. So if you are any other device, or if you're doing anything else besides primary key derivation, or if you're not a TPM, then this letter does not apply to you. So that's unfortunate. Then there's also inconsistencies between different evaluation labs. If you some labs will allow seed reuse, but only if you're doing it once per boot cycle. So you can start with your entropy source, write it to your persistent store, initialize your DRBG and get your asymmetric key, but then you can't reinitialize a DRBG until you've rebooted. That is an interesting interpretation of the rules. Don't think it holds up under close scrutiny, but some labs will allow this. Other labs will not. And it leads to significant pain when you're trying to recertify a module that has already been certified and deployed to all your users, but the new lab doesn't agree with the old lab's interpretation, and now you have to change your crypto, which might lead to significant data loss. If you have to change the way your keys are derived and you're using it to encrypt anything. So this leads to the second proposal. How do we make DRBGs work in this world? This is some language we put together, and the intention here was not to say we want the word key DRBG to show up in the final spec, but this is just to kind of illustrate to NIST what we think is a way forward, roughly. To define some construct, call it key DRBG in this presentation, with some properties in that the entropy input does not come from an entropy source, but from a cryptographic. We can reuse the input and nonce across instantiations, and I mentioned that reseeding operation where you can push fresh entropy into your DRBG. There's no need for that here, so we can just say, nope, can't reseed this thing. The intention here is that you spin this up to produce some output, and then you throw it away. It's not a long-lived construct. So some use cases for this thing. Anytime you use a KDF, you can drop in one of these key DRBGs. It will provide pretty much the same output properties. But unlike a KDF, it is stateful. So if you need to pull repeated bits out of it, you can do that instead of lashing together a KDF and a counter. But kind of warning bells here, like this key, unlike other key DRBGs, which pretty much, if they're done properly, will never output duplicate bits. This thing, by design, outputs duplicate bits. It will not ensure that it always outputs brand new. And this is the thing which we feel is going to give NIST some pause, is that a lot of care is being taken to ensure that if you're using a DRBG, you're doing it properly, and it will never provide duplicate bits, never have the possibility to repeat itself. And here we are saying, hey, there's a really good reason for it to repeat itself. So there's a concern here that if they allow this, that people will start using this construct in cases where they really shouldn't, and have very broken crypto as a result. Any questions so far or comments?
Yeah, this is great, Jeff. You mentioned the TPM exemption or exception. What quantifies a TPM? Like if you had a device that ran a virtual TPM, there's that, or I don't know even what quantifies a virtual TPM. You had a device that ran a TPM stack.
Yeah.
Is that exempt?
Yeah, I'm not a CMP lab, so I can't speak for them, but my understanding is if you are implementing the TPM 2.0 API, you are a TPM module, and you can do what the TPM API calls for as far as deterministic key generation for primary key derivation.
Oh, interesting. So if you implement the mandatory APIs for like client profile, you can use you
Yeah,
qualify for the NIST exception?
Yeah, that's my understanding. And also, my understanding is that there are other um, places in the TPM API that call for deterministic key derivation, but don't but are not approved because they don't use the DRBG. But that's, again, I'm not a TPM vendor and I'm not a CMP lab, so I can't like say authoritatively about that. But that's my understanding, is that, yeah, if you implement a TPM API, implement the TPM API, you're in scope for that letter. So yeah, so just to illustrate the difference between a key DRBG and a KDF, they operate very similarly. Like, all the inputs are analogous to each other. Your entropy input and nonce is equivalent to your key input and your IV. Both of them have room for passing extra data. So label and context for KDF is analogous to your personalization string for a DRBG. This is a key derivation function, right? Given the certain inputs, the function will produce an output. You can think of a DRBG, a key DRBG, as more of a key derivation generator. You instantiate with these inputs and it will generate repeated keys over and over, each of which are distinct from each other. So this satisfies the TPM use case, right? The input is a cryptographic key. It came from an RBG, so that makes it qualify. You have your inputs and you can produce your deterministic outputs. Satisfies this this RFC use case. This is the deterministic ECDA signature generation. The private key is collision resistant, and the messenger, they're both collision resistant. The private key came from a DRBG, so that provides sufficient randomness, and we can repeatedly sample this thing and get and eventually obtain a valid K. It also satisfies the dice use case. You can run this DRBG through a tree of KDFs. This part here, when you're just deriving a tree of secrets out of all of these KDF derivations, this is legal, explicitly called out in this publication as allowed. It's just taking that last step of the output of any one of these KDFs and running it through a DRBG. That is the bridge which we haven't crossed just yet, as far as the specifications go. This is what a key DRBG would allow. And now we're fine. You could optionally just say, hey, anytime a KDF exists in this diagram, just put a key DRBG there, and it would provide equivalent security properties instead of using KDFs and DRBGs as interchangeably. Yeah, so you can have the key hierarchy of key DRBGs. Anytime you have sibling keys, you could either reinstantiate this key DRBG with a different input, or you could just pull subsequent bits out of it because it has internal state. Now, this is a tricky one because there is a naming problem here. This is how the world works right now, that these two documents define a DRBG in a very restricted manner, in that it has a DRBG mechanism. This is a deterministic machinery which mixes bits together, and it is combined with a randomness source. This randomness source could either be a TRNG or it could be a different DRBG. And 90C defines some rigid rules around how you can arrange DRBGs in a chain. Either way, this provides randomness or pseudo-randomness. It is not deterministic at all. So definitionally, you cannot have a DRBG unless you include a source of randomness. This does not leave any room for a DRBG which behaves deterministically. So what would be nice is if we define a DRBG as a thing which has a mechanism and some seed source. And then a different document can say, all right, yeah, when you plug in a randomness source into this template, you arrive at one of these constructions. Or a different document can say, hey, when you take this construct and plug in a key material source, a deterministic source, then it is a key derivation generator, a la key DRBG. So this would take a while to sort out. because we got to figure out exactly what kind of language they want to put down. They want to make sure they don't just throw the baby out with the bathwater and allow all sorts of deterministic randomness generation when that would be unsafe. So it's gonna be a slog. But we do have some short-term needs, right? We have modules that are coming out the pipeline and they want to do dice and they want to do it in a NIST-approved fashion to get their FIP certificate. And it is plainly safe, right? All this is safe to do. It just happens to not be supported by the guidelines as they currently exist. So what we would like NIST to do is to issue a follow-up letter, very similar to the one they already issued for TPMs, and just say, hey, this is more general than just a TPM. Because that's the problem, right? It's like they've allowed it for TPMs, they have not allowed it for anyone else. So dice and anything else which is there are several things which aren't even dice that would benefit from these constructs. So yeah, this letter which we've drafted here, just a draft suggestion, kind of has the exact same language, but just doesn't restrict it to any one technology. There are some constructions which we can call out as things which we can expect NIST to receive if they receive requests to review from labs. The design elements are, we always start with some deterministic input and you run it through. You can run it through a KDF and just straight up use your mod hashing rejection sampling to get your ECC key. You could run it through a GRBG, or you could not have the intermediate KDF and just straight from a deterministic seed to your GRBG. So, for example, dice construction, kind of already illustrated this, a KDF, a tree of KDFs, then terminating in your GRBG, from which you derive an ECC key. Rejection sampling, you could have that counter construction where you're repeatedly incrementing a counter. You could put GRBGs everywhere, as posited earlier. You could have a single GRBG. Remember, this thing is stateful, so we can push measurements in, permute the internal state, pull some bits out to get our level 0 ECC key, and you can just leave that GRBG running until the L1 measurements come in, and then you pull bits out again to get your ECC key. In that sense, your CDI is effectively the internal state of the GRBG. That is your secret sauce there. I'm not aware of a construction which actually does this, but could conceivably imagine it happening. TPM does this, right? We have our persistent entropy, initialize the GRBG, get some metadata in, and use one of these methods to derive your key pairs. Of course, eventually this will do PQC, post-quantum crypto. And here's an example of something which is neither DICE nor TPM. We've been harping along those lines a lot, but two-factor authentication security key may want to do this, where you have some persistent entropy, and then your metadata is information about the website origin, which you then produce a key pair specific to that website. So, all right, pause there. Any comments, questions? Cool. So status of this is we've presented this to NIST, and I'm hopeful that within the next handful of weeks, we will receive that letter, which will allow us to proceed with unblocking certification for these parts, which are these modules which do DICE and other flavors of asymmetric key derivation deterministically. And we'll keep the community apprised as that develops.
Yeah, it seems a little bit silly that you implement some TPM APIs and you have an effective workaround.
Yeah. There's some other concerns we've identified in these specs. They're not specifically asymmetric key derivation, but they are related. There's an inconsistency in some implementation guidance. So if you are accepting entropy from outside your module, let's say you have an approved DRBG and you're receiving your seed from outside the module, NIST does recognize that as something which you might do, but since you're receiving your entropy from outside the module, you don't have your own internal TRNG, you can't claim, or rather NIST cannot say how strong that security is. It depends on what the guy outside your module is doing, and that guy outside your module might be like some HSM in your manufacturing line producing entropy, hypothetically. So you have to have this caveat: no assurance of the minimum strength of generated SSPs. So a couple problems with this. One, it's inconsistent with the KDF. If you are, if you have your fuses and you're instantiating DRBG, you have that caveat there saying you can't claim any security strength. But if you're feeding into a KDF instead, there is no caveat requirement, because that caveat requirement applies specifically to when you're instantiating DRBG, which is kind of silly. So it should apply equally. And there's also been a concern raised that if someone sees that, they're going to be scared and say, oh, is there no security strength at all of these things? What gives? And it's no, there is strength. It's just FIPS can't say what that strength is because FIPS does not look at your manufacturing line. So it'd be nice if we could massage that language to say something more accurate, which is that it's defined by your manufacturer or whoever put that entropy in.
Just a note, sorry, on that topic. What I've seen typically done is, as part of the security policy, this doesn't fix the fact that the caveat, which is the actual cert on the website, is going to still have just that generic statement. But in the security policy, I typically have seen some kind of more verbose statement about around this problem that basically it's reliant on the operator of the module to ensure sufficient entropy. I wonder if something similar can't be done with, in this case, that that the manufacturer has ensured enough entropy or something, even though there's this caveat that the module can't validate. You look to the manufacturer to guarantee that they've provided enough entropy.
I see.
You can see like what I'm talking about in terms of what for operator, like if you look at let's say the OpenSSL cert, they have this caveat, and they have in their security policy some guidance that the operator needs to provide this assurance effectively.
Okay, so there's room for extra. You can provide extra color to it.
Yeah, but it's in the security policy. Not everybody looks at that. People just sometimes just look at the cert on the website, and you're still going to have this generic statement there, right?
Makes sense. Yeah. Also, I just want to call out Thomas Bone has been very, very awesome at collaborating on this engagement with NIST. So yeah, thank you for being involved.
Thanks.
Yes. I mentioned some RBG chaining rules. So this isn't so big. It's just that when you read these when you read the specs, it says the way that the specs kind of read, it says that if you're chaining these things together, that they have to be like live, and that they're like essentially right next to each other. As in, if I want to instantiate the sub DRBG, I actually make a call out to the RBG1. That's pretty clear. And if I want to instantiate RBG1, I have to actually make a call out to RBG2 or 3. It does not appear to be intended for me to be able to take the output of an RBG2 or 3, write it to persistent storage, and then use that later to spin up an RBG1. And in conversation with NIST, they've agreed with that interpretation. It was not intended to allow for some persistent state in between these two layers. However, given that when the IG talks about taking an RBG and using stored entropy, what's it talking about? What kind of DRBG is that? It can't be any of these. So just some minor clarification needed. Nonce reuse. This is, again, not going to be as much of an issue because the later versions of SP800 are going to do away with the nonce requirements. But as it is right now, there is a requirement not only can your seed never repeat itself, but your nonce also must be unique. That must be unique to the module in which instantiation is performed. However, if your nonce is a timestamp, that kind of implies that two modules can't instantiate DRBG at the same time. They can't use the same timestamp. That's not enforceable. So, but that's, again, this will be fine because we're going to do away with the nonce language anyways, and just say you just got to have extra bits as your entropy input. And just some minor conflicting language around reseeding. So not important. They're going to fix that. So yeah, that was the deck. And I am encouraged by the feedback we've gotten from this so far. Looks like they agree with our requests and should have resolution shortly. Any other questions or comments?
So when you say they agreed with the request, you're saying that they are working on the letter, and that would
Yes.
be the final outcome. Okay.
That will be the outcome for the short term, and then yeah, that unblocks us, and I would still like to remain engaged with them to make sure that whatever they put out is sensible. But yeah, be a longer time horizon. And
Yeah,
what I
because
mean by put out officially.
I heard that even with the previous letter with the TPMs that they did that as it was supposed to be a short term, and then long term they were supposed to go and address this, address it a bit more officially in the actual SP800 specs or FIPS specs. And then that seemed to have been forgotten because they never did that. And we've been told now more recently, well, I wish you guys would have brought this up earlier. It's like, well, somebody brought it up several years ago because the TPM, it was discussed as part of, in the context of TPMs. Just, yeah, something got dropped at some point. So I think it's important for us to try to stay engaged with NIST and make sure that they actually follow through with this, and so that we actually get it in official standards as opposed to just being a letter.
Mm-hmm. And
Clearly, so a lot of great work you did here. What was the process for doing this, and how long did it take you?
Basically, reaching out to the a bunch of people that we knew were interested in this problem. We put together a long report on this, and then we elected to turn that report into this slide deck, and then basically some magical hallway conversations at TCG members meetings is what kind of kicked things off for me, at least. Is got to meet with one of the NIST cryptographers who attended, and then got in touch with some people at NSA who were also interested, and went from there. As far as how long it took, I think for me at least, I mean, I know this has been Thomas, you've been working on this for a while, I think, but my involvement, I think it took about a couple months before we got to actually sit down with NIST.
Yeah, we started in early mid-February, and then yeah, I'd agree. Was it March or April when we actually met with them and did the proposal and everything, right?
Yeah, it was a bit of a challenge getting that scheduled because there was not strong agreement on whose problem it was, like which sub-body within NIST. So there's a bit of back and forth before we could herd all the cats and make sure everyone's in the room at the same time.
There also seemed to be a prioritization issue. They didn't. It seemed like I recall you mentioning, Jeff, that there were some views within NIST that this wasn't that big of an issue, or it wasn't something that needed to be prioritized. And that was very concerning to me because
Yes, yes, more. It's like the rules are what they are, and go follow them. It's like, yeah, no.
It's remarkably fast. Thank you for doing this.
well, to be clear, we're still very much in at the early stages with this whole thing, right? There is no actual NIST specs that actually allow this yet. At best, what we have is kind of similar to a request for guidance and a response on the request for guidance in the form of this kind of letter. So it's very early, I think, still. But yeah, I'm pretty hopeful. We seem to be getting kind of promising responses from this.
So the first step would be to get a letter like was issued for the TPMs, and then the second step would be to change the standard.
Yep,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay, got
They'll
it.
be, short term is letter, medium term, quote unquote medium term is, get the special publications updated so we can use GRBGs officially, or other, so that the way we use GRBGs can be officially sanctioned instead of just, unofficially sanctioned, or allowed. And then long term, again, I'd like to target 186-5 and allow for all the KDF use cases.
Makes sense.
Cool. So the latter will unblock all the inconsistency and ambiguity right now at labs.
That is the goal. Yes, that's what I would expect.
Cool. This is awesome.
There's also a cryptographic module users forum, which Thomas, you've been active in a lot more than I have, but I think it'd be useful to. We have spoken there, and it'd be useful to spread the word among the labs and say, hey, new world order, this is now legal.
Yeah, just to be clear, the letter still leaves it a little bit ambiguous because the letter will not explicitly call out like specific things that are allowed. It's more a statement that these kinds of things may be allowed, and you need to get it vetted by NIST, which I think still leaves some ambiguity. The hope is that through CMUF, like we can maybe try to have something proposed that actually would specify, hey, according to this letter, if you provide these kinds of designs, then we generally will allow those kinds of things. Yeah. That's my hope, at least. So and then that will provide a lot more or remove a lot more ambiguity.
Mm-hmm. My reading of the TPM letter is that it's like it might be allowed, and if you want, you can go ask NIST for guidance, and here's what you would need to do if you want to ask. But I don't know if maybe it does require you to ask. But however, I've at least one lab I've talked to, they certify TPMs and they don't ask NIST every time because it's kind of understood. Oh, TPM is fine. So yeah, the hope would be we don't have to bother NIST every time we want to go certify something, as long as it's generally understood that these deterministic asymmetric key derivation flows are legit. But yeah, some kind of document that's saying here's the kind of things that are allowed. Yeah, that would be nice.
Do you think this would eventually drive some significant change in the testing FIPS testing process to test these constructs to make sure that they don't get confused, and you don't make sure your RBG and your KDF construct is unique and separate and works independently in every case?
That's as part of the FIPS validation. That's effectively what's been holding this up to some degree. They don't. I mean, maybe it's not exactly like, oh, let's go test it, but it's like design reviews and things like that, where labs will go and see, hey, what is your construct? How are you generating your asymmetric keys? And then what they're doing right now is saying, oh no, that's not allowed. So with this letter and everything, it would allow us to now get past that when you're doing these kinds of design reviews with the FIPS labs, they would know that, okay, NIST is saying that these kinds of designs are allowed, and therefore you can pass FIPS validation, and with this piece of it in scope for the actual validation. So what this should allow you to do then to be able to say is like, okay, I'm providing a DICE service and it can be all kind of labeled as quote unquote FIPS approved.
Okay, thanks.
So is the end goal for this to be allowed or for it to be required?
This being
Allowed. Why would it be required? I don't understand the question.
Well, required so you can also meet attestation requirements. That's what I understood. Maybe I'm wrong.
I think that the goal is like, if your customer requirements call for deterministic key derivation, this should allow that to be done.
Okay. So if another requirement requires attestation, then you can do it this way and meet that requirement.
I mean, in some sense, like, you could do, and maybe there are DICE implementations that do attestation and stay within the guidelines of NIST, and the way they do that is by, exporting wrapped keys, or making your DICE keys purely asymmetric, or sorry, purely random every time, which, functionally that can, serve some attestation use cases, but other use cases like sealing, that does not work. And obviously you can't issue long-lived certificates for any of those purely random keys. So it's generally easier to satisfy all of the various DICE attestation use cases if you can just make your keys deterministic off some seed.
Okay, thank you. That helps. I look at it from a product planning perspective on my side.
Gotcha. Let's see, there was a question in chat. Forgive me for missing one point. How does using a DRBG in the way you recommend does address your initial problem of not having to store all the derived keys? The DRBG does not allow repeatability since it has state. So the idea is that you could reinstantiate the DRBG from scratch whenever you need to make your key. So you wouldn't have to worry about this. That DRBG state doesn't stick around between asymmetric key derivation events. And yeah, feel free to follow up with me. Okay, yeah, okay, sweet. Sounds good. Cool. Well, yeah, thanks all. So yeah, I'll keep everyone, Thomas and I will keep everyone updated as we make progress with this and get that letter out.
Please
Yeah,
post
thanks a
your
lot.
slides soon.
What was that?
Please post your slides soon.
Oh, yes, we'll do. We'll do right
Thank
away.
you.
All right. See y'all.
So until we get that letter, we have to stub out some TPM APIs.
Pretty much, and then jerry rig, and then call whatever we're doing primary key derivation.
Yeah.
Put DICE measurements into your policy for your TPM object.
All right. Thanks a lot, Jeff. This is great. Yeah, and Thomas, thanks.
Ciao.